Um, Hello everybody, and it's my pleasure to welcome everyone here at our first webinar of the network Rethinking Modern Greek Studies in the 21st Century. My name is Kristina Gedgaudaite, and I am a postdoctoral fellow at the Princeton University Seeger Center for Hellenic Studies. But my journey there started in Oxford through Amsterdam. So I feel very much at home here today, and it's my pleasure to welcome everybody here as well. This is the first talk in a series, and Maria and Dimitriou will say a few words about both our network and the plans for the future talks that we are going to host throughout the duration of this year. For now, as I said, a very warm welcome for everybody. In a chat, I will post a few links for those who are not familiar with the network to get a little bit more idea of what we've been up to. But for now, thank you very much for joining, everybody, and very welcome.
Thank you, Kristina. A very warm welcome from me as well. Well, looking at the names of those who are present today, I see already a lot of people who are already part of our network or connected to it somehow, which is great. But for those of you who are sort of new to this initiative, just a few words about what this network is about, how it came about. And then I'll give the word to Dimitriou, who will say a few things about this roundtable series that we are kicking off today. So this series is part of the cultural analysis network that we named Rethinking Modern Greek Studies in the 21st Century. We launched it about a year ago, officially in January 2020, when we had our first conference in Oxford. And this initiative sort of emerged from a partnership between the universities of Oxford and Amsterdam, and the communities working in these universities in modern Greek studies, or also in other fields that somehow dovetail with modern Greek studies. And those include the subfaculty of Byzantine and Modern Greek in Oxford, the Department of Modern Greek in Amsterdam, but also the Dutch Society for Modern Greek Studies, the NGNS, and the research and reading group, Crisis, Critique, and Futurity, that I coordinate in Amsterdam together with Eva Fotiadi. And Dimitriou, if I'm forgetting another group here, please jump in. So this network has received the financial support of Torch, of course, to which we are really grateful, and which also was the main sponsor of our first conference. But it's also supported by the Ekaterini Laskaridis Foundation, which is the main sponsor of the Marilena Laskaridis Chair in Amsterdam, and the subfaculty of Byzantine and Modern Greek at Oxford. And we'll have also the support of another partner in the near future, but I cannot say anything about that yet. Our ambition is to not have this be limited to 2 universities, of course, and the members we already have, including those who took part in our conference, basically come from many universities from all throughout Europe, but also from the US. And it's our ambition to make this a broader network and include more partners and more universities, and of course, individual members. So everyone can join the network. We particularly welcome early career scholars, the kind of new dynamic generation that could radically rethink and renew the field through new debates, like the one that we'll be having today. Just to mention that we also have a blog on the Torch website, which emerged from our first conference, with contribution from participants in that conference, and we regularly add new stuff to the blog. So if some of you, including the panelists, want to contribute a blog entry inspired by the debates in these roundtables, please get in contact with us. And one last thing, we're planning a second conference in Amsterdam this fall. Obviously, that couldn't happen live, but we hope to be able to host it in the not so far future, Corona Volente, of course, next fall, perhaps. And in the meantime, we didn't want to lose the momentum that was shaped at that first conference. So this webinar series emerged from this wish to continue the conversations that started at the conference and to also address some topics that were not represented enough at that conference. Yeah, so I'll just give the word to Dimitriou, who can tell you a few things about this series in particular.
Thank you, Maria and Christina. Thank you to all for coming. I am aware that other people will join us as we progress, and also that many students, many colleagues will be watching this as it will be recorded and posted eventually. We, as my colleague said, we think of this as a multimedia venture as well as a conference and meetings venture when things become possible again. We will be meeting, but before that we have scheduled this series of webinars, and I need to stress now that this webinar is being recorded. Of course, the people whom you are seeing now have all given their assent. They have all agreed to being recorded. Those of you who are watching us and want to ask a question can post the question on the chat or the Q&A in the Q&A period. If you decide to raise your hand and speak, or even speak and use your camera, this means that you are giving us that you are agreeing to being recorded and thus represented in the future in this video that will be posted online. Now, please keep writing to us and keep our emails, our links to the blog. You can find all details there, and send us any ideas you have. The reason we have not yet we have not yet published a full list of events is that we are working in a way to try to organize things that are very current, that we haven't necessarily even thought about when we first set this last year. And this is why next month we are at the moment organizing one such event per month. Next month, our next month's topic will be Golden Dawn. The title we're working on is Golden Dawn, Is This the End of the Road? And you will hear about this very soon, about this event. And the December event is called Islands and Camps, from Leros to Lesbos. You will hear very soon about that event too. But of course, a series of events in January, February, March are still being organized, and we will welcome your advice, your input, your feedback. Anything really. This is also about offering work to the network, and anyone who wants to write a blog is very welcome to do so. Blogs are being then vetted, read by us, and if they meet a standard, published online. Once again, thanks to Torch, the Oxford Research Centre in the Humanities, who has made this possible, to Anbara Khalidi in particular, who has been very much on the support for this network since the beginning. I will give it now to my colleague Eleni Papargiriou, who will be chairing this meeting, and thank you all for joining.
I'm jumping in just to clarify, in case that wasn't clear, that if anyone who wants to participate in the Q&A will not appear on camera, just the voice will be heard, I suppose, but will not appear on camera. So only the panelists will be on camera regarding the permissions issue. Thank you.
Well, good evening for me also. I'm Eleni Papargiriou. I teach modern Greek literature at the University of Patras, and it's a huge pleasure to chair this first roundtable discussion with the title Green Ecoturn in Modern Greek Studies. And I was thinking what a huge pleasure it is to be able to combine so many people from different places. And I suppose coronavirus and all the restrictions it has posed has given us a huge opportunity. I'm in Thessaloniki, other people are in London, in Oxford, in Amsterdam, and different parts of the world. Well, the way this roundtable discussion will evolve, each of our three speakers will give a 15-minute presentation, and then we'll have plenty of time for discussion. And I think I should give the presentations, the speakers' presentations in the order they will give their talks, right? And not in the beginning. So we'll start with Daniel Knight, who's a reader in the Department of Social Anthropology and director of the Centre for Cosmopolitan Studies at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland. Daniel's first book, History, Time and Economic Crisis in Central Greece, was published in 2015 and explores how moments of the past are intricately woven together during eras of social upheaval. He has a second monograph coming up in 2021, where he presents a theory of scalar temporal disorientation induced by sudden social change, and it is entitled Vertigo on Temporality and the Unforeseen, which is coming up in 2021. The theme presented by him today is part of a book project with a working title, Renewable Energy in the Age of Austerity, the Green Economy as Neocolonialism. And the title of his talk tonight is Time of Sustainability, the Green Economy as Solution to Chronic Crisis. The floor is open to you, Daniel.
Okay. Good evening. Thank you very much. Thank you, first of all, for the invitation from Maria and Dimitriou and Christina. It's lovely to be part of this network and the events. I wanted to be part of it as soon as sort of Dimitriou mentioned, I think, back at the beginning of the year about setting this up and after the first event. So I'm very, very happy to be here with you this evening. So yeah, this work stems from my research on renewable energy in central Greece in particular, that started in 2011. Itself was a side project of a longer running thing on social change, in particular the social consequences of the Greek economic crisis. And it was really triggered from a moment when I went back to the house where I was staying in Precarity in Thessaly one Christmas, and I hadn't been there. I'd only been away for 6 months or so. And the house overlooked the agricultural plains. And once where there were crops on these agricultural plains, that evening I stood on the top floor of the house and overlooked a fields of photovoltaic panels and solar panels, and you sort of think, well, what's happening here? Why has this been such a great livelihood change quite drastically, quite quickly? And then, of course, as the years went on, those same photovoltaic panels from the same viewpoint would be, you'd be unable to see them because of the smog that would descend over the town in the evenings as these sort of very clean, green, futuristic, ultra-modern technologies of energy production were being swamped by quite a heavy toxic smog of people lighting fires and lighting unsuitable firewood to heat their homes at night. So that sort of was a temporal paradox that I was interested in there as well. So I'm going to do I know that each discipline is quite different in how they present, but in anthropology, we tend to read sort of directly from our texts. So I'm afraid it's going to be a bit of an old school read presentation. But yes, time of sustainability, the green economy, a solution to chronic crisis, ? So the future of the Greek nation was once pinned to the potential of natural resources, particularly the sun and the wind. In the bleak crisis years immediately after the 2009-10 financial collapse, green energy was heralded as the savior of a people and a nation with no future. The global breakdown of the neoliberal system based on unprotected market capitalism that proved the downfall of nations like Greece was to be replaced, both the government, and that was the New Democracy government before the economic crisis, so both the government and the European Union claimed, by sustainable long-term investment in the green economy. In 2011, the future of Greece was in the hands of photovoltaic, solar and wind generation, with public and private investors alike harboring ambitious plans to repay national debt and decrease state deficits through a combination of international energy export and small-scale household sustainability. Farmers began to plant photovoltaics, as they said, and mine the sun for an agreed period of 20 years in return for a modest monthly feed-in tariff. In the early days, for people facing destitution, this seemed like a good deal and often offered alternative visions of life in crisis-ridden Greece. The grassroots popularization of photovoltaic generation in Greece from 2011 was part of a wider time of sustainability that bubbled along as a countercurrent to the 24/7 media coverage of a nation entering the gates of hell. And time of sustainability I've written with capitals, and I know that's sort of my own theoretical imposition, a time of sustainability being my own terminology. But the top-down narratives of futures based on green credentials gave rise to grassroots expectations and aspirations that a sustainable green economy might facilitate alternative social political futures for a nation in a chronic state of crisis. The time of sustainability was reinforced through political rhetoric and practical enterprises that promoted green futures. For instance, in 2015, when the radical left Syriza party swept to power on a message of hope, radical ecology was at the very heart of its constitution. At the same time, a new recycling and environmental responsibility initiative was launched by the Ministry of Environment, Energy and Climate Change, while throughout 2015-16, cycling became not just a practical means for reducing expenditure during times of fiscal austerity, but was established as a major hobby with cycling clubs founded all over Greece. You could even go as far to say that in towns like Trikala, where my research is primarily based, the so-called enforcement of the public indoor smoking ban can be viewed as an associated aspect of the time of sustainability, with an eye on environmental and public health concerns. And that's been quite famous in the popular press as well, how the mayor of Trikala is trying to enforce the smoking ban, which famously, of course, is unenforceable in other parts. Well, I see that as part of this sort of general trend towards environmental and public health consciousness. Well, the most infamous project of all in Trikala was the driverless electric bus. This was doomed to failure, and the infrastructure of the town, however, has been changed beyond recognition. So this was a project whereby a Californian company came in, I believe, and wanted to trial these electric buses, which didn't have drivers. And they decided to try it in Trikala of all places. They got the contracts for it, and they completely transformed the town centre with new cycle lanes, with new bus lanes. Unfortunately, it was doomed to failure because it kept crashing, and there was many incidences of people getting harmed by these things, and it went extremely slowly. But again, it was seen as a sort of investment in an alternative, sustainable future that was forward-looking. You know, it was kind of cutting edge in that respect. So amid wage and pension cuts, unprecedented levels of unemployment, home repossessions and tax hikes, the social infrastructure was being laid for radical change based on orientations of hope, aspiration and sustainability, an affective nebula of optimism based on a potentiality of the green economy. With my colleague Rebecca Bryant, I have recently written on how epochs or times can be collectively perceived, how there is a sense of living within a period, a time space, with particular sets of futural orientations. For our intellectual muse for this project, philosopher Theodor Szadsky, a time space incorporates ends, projects, actions, and combinations thereof that participants should or acceptably pursue. The social infrastructure is shared as people identify with certain affective structures, characteristics, and teleologies. For instance, living in a time of Brexit may evoke panic, apocalyptic speculation, perhaps resignation for the Remainer. A time of peace in the Middle East may be eaten into by the anticipation of imminent displacement and violence, breaking through the temporal horizon of the future to inhabit the present and guide social practice accordingly. The Greek time of crisis has been described to me and to other ethnographers as being characterized by paralysis, stuckedness, the abject resignation that the future might simply be more of the same, a state of hardship and continued turmoil. However, as future orientation, this epochal paralysis is at odds with the hope-filled momentum associated with the early days of the Greek renewable energy revolution and sustainability drive. In this new mini-epoch of a time of sustainability, hope-induced social and political programs encourage people to imagine how physical as well as societal potentialities inherent in things like the sun and wind might be actualized for a better future. Alas, the time of sustainability and associated future orientations of hope and aspiration did not last long. Renewable energy and the green economy more generally has, broadly speaking, proven to be a wolf in sheep's clothing, promising sustainable growth and clean, green, environmental friendly power, only to fall prey to extractive economies operating on the same principles of neoliberal capital accumulation as oil production and mineral mining. Owing in part to petty corruption, but primarily to highly inflated rates, subsidies for feed-in tariffs have dried up. Engineering challenges have scuppered plans for international export of renewable energy, and foreign corporations have divvied up the green energy sector, leading to so-called green grabbing, and renewable generation has failed to serve the local communities. In the latter instance, from 2012, people began resorting to what they termed archaic or peasant or village means to heat their homes, namely burning wood, old furniture, and at times household waste, leading to claims that the green economy is nothing but another form of neoliberal extractive economy. And there you also have this temporal paradox as well, like I say, where they were saying, people say, well, we have this sort of promised future of high-tech, ultra-modern, futuristic materiality on our lands, these photovoltaic panels that are showing us that we're going in a certain direction towards certain political and social goals. But on the other hand, because they're not serving the community, this energy is being siphoned off for export and towards urban centers. We're having to light all these types of things to keep warm at night, and it's causing these toxic smogs. We're actually feeling that we're going sort of back in time. It's almost like a inversion of this temporal arrow of or trajectory towards the past rather than towards the future that the renewable energy offers. So for the majority of my research participants in central Greece, imaginations of a time of sustainability have been emphatically defeated. The hope that was generated by the budding solar industry has turned to apathy. Planning for sustainable futures has collapsed into disillusion with green programs, and a creative method for dealing with the consequences of financial crisis has bred resignation that even green initiatives are extractive capitalist ventures. The social infrastructure and temporal orientations associated with the time space of sustainability are quickly disappearing from mainstream imaginations of the future. But I ask, how does this help us understand global debates on green futures away from Greece? Since the brief of this workshop is to take local debates and speak to global questions. Well, green economy has been seen as a continued legacy of wildly unfulfilled promises dating to the global 2008 financial crash. It has also recently reared its head as a political response to predictions of chronic economic woes in the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic. The green economy is once again at the forefront of long-term governmental policies for rebuilding society after crisis. In numerous European nations, solar and wind energy continue to feature prominently in long-term policy planning, including recently in the last 2 months in the UK, Germany, Italy, and Spain. In October 2020, the UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson announced plans for his nation's post-COVID-19 recovery, and it was to be based on the green economy. In his headline, he said, which was entitled Build Back Greener, this manifesto, he committed £350 million to green fuel and pledged that every UK home will be powered by renewable energy by 2030. His rhetoric of £2.6 billion on the green recovery, creating thousands of jobs, alongside promises for energy self-sufficiency and sustainability as a way to drag this meandering, falling economy out of its quagmire, hold remarkable resonance with the Greek government announcements on green economic futures in the face of crisis at an event that was held in Megaromouzikis in 2011. And even this morning, since writing this, I was also looking at an LSE podcast with Mary Calder, who works on the Cold War, saying that the future of the European Union should be built only on new social contracts with green credentials. And I think that's a quote, new social contracts based on green credentials. And she says this should even take priority over new diversity policies, even new feminist policies. The EU and the future of this sort of massive conglomeration of nation states has to be based on the new social contract with green credentials post-COVID-19. So a time of sustainability as a response to economic woes is nothing new, and we may be able to learn from the problems encountered in Greece, which seems to once again be a forerunner in trialling socio-economic models that will be rolled out across the globe. And this may be done knowingly or not, and I think Michael Hertzfeld would probably say that this is another form of crypto-colonial experimental exercise going on within the nation. Indeed, in my first visits to Greece in the 1980s, solar thermal, which is solar storage for heating water, was already popular, while remaining almost unheard of in other parts of the continent. The question is whether a time of sustainability can ever deliver on promises of long-term green futures while operating within the neoliberal system of corporate capitalism and resource extraction. In central Greece, disenfranchisement and disillusion are probably the best terms to describe popular views of the green economy a decade on from the launch of the renewables programme, as resources continue to be siphoned away from local communities. And I think that anthropologists in particular, working at the grassroots level, can facilitate communication between local communities and governments on issues of global concerns such as ecological sustainability and climate change. As it stands, there are too many contradictions between government programs and promises for green futures and the everyday experience of energy policy as lived on the ground. Yet the problems of sustainability and climate responsibility are of planetary importance, and I strongly believe that for academics, an interdisciplinary approach that builds on the lessons learned from local cases, like this one in central Greece, to feed back into macro-scale policies and programs is the best way forward to address at least some of the inconsistencies. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daniel, for this very rich talk, which I think gave us a lot of new material to think of the green economy as a solution to the chronic crisis, but also to problematize it. I mean, problematize what this solution means, that it's not as straightforward as it might have been thought. We'll take questions at the end. We take questions addressed to each speaker at the end, and then we'll open the floor to a general discussion. So we open, now we give the floor to Eveline Mineur. Eveline is an MA student of Translation Studies at the University of Amsterdam and an MA student of Arts and Cultural Heritage at Maastricht University. If I understood correctly, that Eveline in her BA project combined a cultural analysis approach with her affinity with modern Greek studies and analyzed 3 contemporary Greek cultural products while engaging with temporalities of crisis of ecocriticism. Her current research interests are translation studies, migration and mobility studies, environmental cultural analysis, and dissonant cultural heritage. Eveline's title tonight is Beyond the End of a Summertime Civilization, an ecocritical reading of Sotiris Dimitriou's novella, The Silence of the Dry Weed. Thank you.
Okay, I will just share my screen with you all. One moment. Okay, here we are. Yes, so thank you very much, everyone who's here. Thank you, Eleni, of course, for the introduction, Marissia and Daniel for your work, sharing your work with us today. And of course, thank you to Christina, Maria, and Dimitri. Thank you warmly for the opportunity for me to also contribute something to this specific roundtable. Maybe just as a small addition to Eleni's introduction is that I'm currently geographically located on the Greek island Rhodos, just so you have a full picture of this talk. Okay, so the topic of my talk tonight is Beyond the End of Summertime Civilization. As you heard, an ecocritical reading of Sotiris Dimitriou's novella, The Silence of the Dry Weed, η σιωπή του ξερόχορτου. But before we get to the novella, I would first like to contemplate for a brief moment the location of modern Greek studies vis-a-vis the eco-turn in the humanities. All right. Now, as one of the very early scholars here tonight, it was relatively easy for me to trace my personal evolving engagement with an ecologically or environmentally informed approach to modern Greek studies. And I think this trace of academic ecological engagement will shed some light on the location of modern Greek studies towards this eco-turn in the humanities as a whole. So here on the slide, you see some scholars and concepts that have influenced my personal position as a cultural analyst, with Greece as an area of special interests. Now, here is Jeff Diamandi, and some concepts that are related to his work are petroculture, for instance, Energy and Capital, one of his books. Then there's Anna Tsing, who wrote on assemblages and interspecies entanglements. And then the speaker that you just heard, I hope Daniel won't mind that I put his picture there, is Daniel Knight. And especially also some of the work he presented with you today. Another concept or phrase here, the green economy is neocolonialism, I think is part of his, the working title of his, one of the upcoming works. Now, okay. Then we also see here the disciplines that these scholars are related to. I think they show part of the spread of a growing critical environmental awareness within the humanities. Personally, I identify green energy transition, energy cultures, and energy representation as a parcel of the global debate that global warming is, to which Greek local cases can contribute. And not just Greek local cases, of course, also other local cases. Think, for instance, of the phenomenon of big data centers of multinationals like Microsoft and Google being expanded at the moment in the Netherlands using amounts of green energy, which could also be used for the energy transition of Dutch households in order to meet the Paris Agreement. Okay, now having said this, I will turn to the main topic of my presentation. All right. In the current conjuncture of the COVID-19 pandemic, pressing migration issues and extreme weather events resulting from global warming, the list of contemporary phenomena referred to as crises, one moment, is getting longer and longer. And its entanglement, of course, demands our attention. The debts we've collectively accumulated, both financial and ecological, makes a future untangled from these crises increasingly difficult to imagine. Now, my thesis for modern Greek studies, which was supervised by Maria Boletsi and Andi Archiriou, was written during the Dutch lockdown of last spring, under circumstances of social near isolation in a global, national and personal environment of insecurity. Now, aware of very concrete loss of the illusion of control over the future, I asked myself the following. So when a present of crises impedes our ability to imagine futures alternative to the present, then what shape do the imagined alternative futures take that do take place? So visions of the future that are being imagined. And to answer this question, I've analyzed a selection of contemporary Greek cultural objects that each sketch a vision of the future of the Aegean archipelago in different shades of utopia and dystopia. Now you see the different cultural objects here on the slide. Today I will present a reading of one of the cultural objects from this selection, which I thought would be suitable within the ecocritical framework of this evening, which is Sotiris Dimitriou's novella, The Silence of the Dry Weed. In the novella, author Sotiris Dimitriou has imagined an alternative future of what used to be the Greek nation state. The formerly Greek islands become an autonomous society and soon develop morals, norms, and values radically different to those of the past family democracy, as the Greek nation state is being referred to in the novella. Institutions, for instance, like the church, marriage, the nuclear family, they are seen as some of the causes for the problems of the old society and are done away with. Economic growth and the formerly dominant narratives of progress are rejected, and a utopian, ecologically sustainable island society emerges, bordered by neighboring societies, which on the other hand continue to follow this path of development, anaptixi. In this summertime civilization, the rhythm of life is slowed down to one more in tune with that of nature. At night, and I quote, "The natural darkness was only bastardized by the light that spilled over the borders of the neighboring states who had taken the road of development and who had a myriad of lights. It was like a halo crowned their country." Despite the presentation of this society and its island inhabitants as the complete opposite of the old family democracy, some characteristics that are suggested as innate to all human beings in the end determined the society's downfall. The final pages of the novella are dedicated to describing the inland, an uncharted and undeclared border zone to which neighboring countries had been banning people unfit to the rules of their societies for years. One character is taken up by the inhabitants of this border zone and joins their way of living, which means going from village fest to village fest in the summer, entertaining people with their music, and in winter sitting in a huge communal coffee house, making their characteristic low, lamenting, earthy music and dancing. Now, after the demise of the island society, in my reading, this character symbolizes the continuation of human life in the story world of the novella, in this radically different border zone civilization. It is the significance of the downfall of the island society and the continuation of human life in the border zone that I want to focus on during today's presentation. In order to do that, we'll first take a closer look at the working of the summertime civilization. The driving force of this civilization's transition to self-sufficiency and energy neutrality is their technological innovation and their holistic beliefs, which support human life in harmony with their surroundings, which expresses themselves in the form of a plant-based diet and the use of biodegradable building materials, for instance. The islanders turn out to be very successful in reducing not just their carbon footprint, but the footprint of their society in general. Almost all traces of the island society were erased soon after its fall. I quote from the book, "The only remnant of this short-lived democracy was what was there to remain anyway. Their houses were made of canvas, and even that environment-friendly, decomposable, were the watchtowers along the coastline for the safety of swimmers." In general, the novella thus treats the negative aspects of consumerist capitalism and humans' exploitative relation to nature, the consequences of which we struggle with in the present, as a problem of the past that has been overcome locally, thanks to drastic reorganizations of society. However, I would like to argue that this novella can do more than reinvigorate an optimist belief in a utopian, ecologically sustainable society. Looked at from the perspective of literary scholar and journalist Roy Scranton, the silence of the dry wheat can perhaps even offer something valuable to a future humanity beyond crisis as an enduring state and a management tool for neoliberal governments. Scranton's philosophical argument starts with situating our present in the Anthropocene, a term I'm sure many of you know, but I'll describe it anyway, a denomination considered to describe a new geological period, namely one in which the human species are no longer just a biological force, but a geological force, impacting the Earth in the long term. Scranton builds on his personal experience as an American soldier in the Iraq War, with the incessant confrontation with this mortality to make an argument about humanity's attitude towards the inevitable disasters caused by humanly induced global climate change. Scranton indicates that the Anthropocene poses conceptual and existential problems that have always been central to humanistic inquiry. For instance, what does it mean to be human? What does it mean to live? Faced with the slim chance of survival of human civilization as we know it in the hotbed that we've created in a geological split second by pumping astronomical amounts of greenhouse gases into the Earth's atmosphere, according to Scranton, we should start rethinking mortality. And not just as an individual predicament, but as the certain future of our current civilization. To survive as a soldier, Scranton poses, I quote again, I had to learn to accept the inevitability of my own death. For humanity to survive in the Anthropocene, we need to learn to live with and through the end of our current civilization. Now, it is not Scranton's objective to stimulate an attitude of pessimism or nihilism in the face of an inevitable death of the human species. On the contrary, for the sake of the survival of human species, Scranton impels the acceptance of the fact that human civilization as we know it, which is the vast majority of human societies globally organized along the lines of consumerist capitalism, with its political and economic structure wholly dependent on unrenewable carbon fossil fuels, he argues that it has already died. We need to accept that in order for us to face the challenge of the Anthropocene without being held back by attachment or fear. I quote, "Learning to die as an individual means letting go of our predispositions and fear. Learning to die as a civilization means letting go of this particular way of life and its ideas of identity, freedom, success, and progress. Scranton sets learning to die as a civilization, and thus coming to terms with the death of human civilization as we know it, as a prerequisite for a successful attitude towards human life in the Anthropocene. In this necessary process of learning to accept the death of our civilization, Scranton reserves a leading role for philosophy and for the humanities in general, and this proves eeringly true in our current COVID-19 circumstances. The following quote: "In order for us to adapt to this strange new world, we're going to need more than scientific reports and military policy. We're going to need new ideas. We're going to need new myths and new stories, a new conceptual understanding of reality beyond carbon-based capitalism." End quote. The humanities can help us to rethink our collective identity as humans, but they can also help us to visualize, reflect on, and work through the painful reality of the death of our civilization. From Scranton's perspective, then, the demise of the island society in the silence of the dry weed, as the death of a civilization, could be seen as one of the literary tools which can help us to process the death of our own current civilization. Now here you see some well-known popular representations of the end of the world, which are usually incredibly dramatic, disasters unknown to humankind, doomsday-like scenarios. There's also a quote from the film 2012, "The world as we know it will soon come to an end." Now, my interpretation of Scranton's argument is that this is true and that this should be true. So the world as we know it, or the human civilization as we know it, it is coming to an end and it should come to an end. So this is a very different interpretation of this quote. Then, in contrast to dozens of these popular imaginations, Dimitriou does not treat the end of the island civilization with much sentiment at all, actually. The author's casual descriptive style implies that the demise of this particular society is a natural development, not a tragedy. This is partly caused by the careless way in which the eventual destruction of the island society takes place. After its careful construction, over roughly 70 pages of description, hardly half a page is dedicated to the military invasions of neighboring states, which puts a definite end to the already slowly deteriorating society. Now, I added this picture, it's from the island where I'm currently at, and today we had very heavy rainfall, and I liked the gloomy element here. So Scranton, he meditated daily on all the possible ways he could die during his work as a soldier in Iraq, which brought him the peace of mind to do his job. Now, Scranton himself admitted this as a shameful excuse of an imperial ideology. But it brought him, however, the peace of mind to act in the present in order to bring about a preferable future outcome. In a similar way, intellectual and artistic formulations of the end of a similar human civilization can help us to come to terms with the death of humanity as it is currently organized. I quote again, "The greatest challenge we face is a philosophical one, understanding that this civilization is already dead. The sooner we confront our situation and realize that there is nothing we can do to save ourselves, the sooner we can get down to the difficult task of adapting with mortal humility to our new reality." Artistic and philosophical imaginations, like Dimitriou's novella, The Silence of the Dry Weed, are the means suited to this difficult yet crucial task. The imagined ending of a civilization in the silence of the dry weed, combined with the continuation of human life in the border zone, could thus serve as one of the answers to Scranton's call for the acceptance of the death of current civilization and a call for reimaginations of what it means to be human in the Anthropocene, which is, among other things, to accept and adapt, according to Scranton. The silence of the dry weed, after all, indicates that after the demise of one civilization, in this case the summertime state, another one starts, one in the border zone, in every aspect. So organization, norms, values, ways of personal expression, radically different from its predecessor. And perhaps because of this difference, the appointed form of continuation of human life in the story world of the novella. In the Anthropocene, this is the role of the humanities and the great power of the arts, to articulate alternatives to our current forms of society, and thus to open up political possibility even beyond the imminent death of our current civilization. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eveline, for this very exciting talk. And I think it's the first time that I've heard Sotiris Dimitriou's novella being discussed from an ecocritical point of view. So this is definitely very exciting for us. We'll take questions to Eveline's talk at the end of this session. So we move on to our next speaker, who is Marissia Fragkou. Marissia is a senior lecturer in performing arts in Canterbury Christchurch University in the UK. Her research focuses on the politics of representation, feminist theatre, affect, ethics, and precarity. Her first monograph is entitled Ecologies of Precarity in 21st Century Theatre, Politics, Affect, Responsibility, and it came out in 2018. And she has co-edited a special issue on contemporary Greek drama with Philip Hager for the Journal of Greek Media and Culture. Her title tonight is Ecologies of Precarity in the Anthropocene, Mobilizing the Non-Human in Contemporary Performance. So I guess, you know, there's a very nice combination here with the previous talk. The floor over to you, Marissia.
Thank you so much, Eleni, and thank you to the organizers, Maria, Dimitris, and Christina, and also to the other speakers. I think there is a lot of synergy here, so yeah, I'm excited about this event. So I'll start sharing my screen and begin my talk. So as Eleni mentioned, hopefully you can see my screen now. I'm coming from a theatre studies, performance studies kind of perspective, but my work is very interdisciplinary. So my paper today will be offering a more kind of theoretical approach in the beginning to the topic of today's discussion, and I will be sharing some work I did for the book Ecologies of Precarity. And in some ways, this paper and the book are in dialogue with the network's remit to revisit notions of crisis, the impact of neoliberal governmentality in shaping contemporary identities, as well as the need to create, you know, further interdisciplinary dialogue surrounding such cultural politics in Greece and beyond. And I will be referring to some examples from the UK that I have researched, but also I will kind of make a link with the Greek context. And I will close with some questions that pertain to kind of Greek performance and Greek studies. So the book was looking at precarity as a sticky political trope that underpins a wide range of theatre and performance practice in the UK since the 90s. And following Sarah Ahmed's argument about how signs and emotions stick to bodies, precarity is not only sticking several conditions of uncertainty and risk together, but also has a felt impact on bodies which have been othered. And I was specifically interested in the political work precarity is doing in the theatre, but also in its function as a paradoxical term. Whilst evoking contemporary conditions of inequality and the differential distribution of vulnerability and uncertainty, precarity can also be read as a vehicle which allows us to reimagine the contours of the human and the non-human, and as Isabel Laurie proposes, to form the starting point for political alliances against the logic of protection and security for some at the cost of many others. So in this sense, I perceive precarity as a social ecology, hence the title of the book, that cuts across different spaces, places, identities, and sociopolitical conditions. And the choice to use the term ecology in the book's title not only alludes to theatre's identity as an ecosystem that many scholars in theatre have mentioned, have discussed, but also draws attention to the affinities between ecology and precarity, as the latter exposes the dimensions of art and interdependency. Ecology is also here used to examine how performances of precarity may leave their mark on ideologies of dispossession, and how in turn they might help to create political actors who resist practices of precarization. So for me, in the book, what became apparent was that this chief focus on vulnerability and interdependency, precarity becomes some kind of a byword for contemporary identity politics in the 21st century. So one of the books I was reading a lot was Theatre Ecology by Bas Kershaw. And this is where he's talking about how in the 20th century, Homo sapiens increasingly became addicted to performance, to the point where the effects of that addiction threatened the survival of the species, which again draws on many interdisciplinary discussions in different disciplines. So for Kershaw, humans' performance addiction, which becomes manifest in forms such as carbon addiction and compulsive global population expansion, is a result of a pervasive double bind, this impasse that Eveline mentioned before, whereby opposing forces such as the intraspecies human violence and violence between the human and the environment are trapped in this kind of vicious circle. So his warning raises significant questions about ecologies of precarity, which, whilst reproducing the conditions that maintain human life, they irreversibly threaten life survival. So he really echoes wider debates in the Anthropocene, where the human impact on the Earth's complex ecosystems is compared to this geophysical force. I mean, this is how the Anthropocene is described, that the anthropos is like a geophysical force and that who contributes to climate change. And this new geological era is marked by a profound anxiety regarding the survival of the planet, followed by sociopolitical quests for environmental sustainability promoted by governments and so on, like Daniel mentioned earlier about the eco-turn and green energy. But we need to realize again that these initiatives, these proclamations to tackle environmental precarity are compromised by capitalist models of growth embedded in the neoliberal TINA doctrine. So it is like a double bind again. So when it comes to kind of how can we break this double bind, or how can we think differently and use kind of the arts as a way to think differently, Kershaw suggests that we need a major revolution in how humans relate both to each other and to the environment. And this means that the Anthropocene needs to be looked at against the larger backdrop of human performance addiction and the sociopolitical conditions and practices which foster the precarization of the human and the non-human. In other words, climate change should be looked at as another culture of politics, paying attention to post-colonial history of exploitation and notions of vulnerability and responsibility, which should be the basis of promoting an ethics of care. So now I'll move to kind of thinking about the Anthropocene, the non-human, in relation to theatre and performance more specifically. But before that, I want to refer to another critical thinker who has really shaped my own thinking, who has also kind of written about precarity, of course. So the era of the Anthropocene also pronounces the necessity to reconfigure life's ontology. And Judith Butler in Frames of War takes issue with anthropocentrism, which renders humanness a shifting prerogative, and calls for reconceiving life itself as a set of largely unwilled interdependencies, which imply that the ontology of the human is not separable from the ontology of the animal. And this is in a book that talks about the war in Iraq, which is very interesting. So Butler's critique of anthropocentrism rehearses ongoing debates in ecocriticism and particularly ecofeminism that we're all familiar with, that recognize the problematic nature of binaries and dualistic thinking. And this is also kind of prevalent and present in theatre ecocriticism, particularly in relation to kind of plays, studying plays, dramatic plays. So some of the key challenges then towards achieving an ethics of care that I mentioned before towards the environment is posed by the difficulty of apprehending the scale and temporality of this environmental precarity. And such difficulties are captured in Norbert Nixon's term, slow violence, which particularly draws attention to the invisible and seemingly static nature of violence against the environment. And for Nixon, the challenge relies primarily in representationally intervening in images and narratives of spectacular violence, endemic in what he calls turbo-capitalism. And he says, the representational challenges are acute, requiring creative ways of drawing public attention to catastrophic acts that are low in instant spectacle, but high in long-term effects. To intervene representationally requires that we find both the iconic symbols to embody amorphous calamities and the narrative forms to infuse them with dramatic urgency. So this is what I find really interesting here. It's like a provocation to kind of artists and theatre makers in this sense, and of course other people who use the arts to represent the world. How can we find representational strategies that kind of reverse the process of so low violence, or kind of capture them? And in thinking about how theatre specifically can promote an ethics of care, I think it is helpful to remind ourselves the importance of the affective impressions that are generated by the use of creative imagination and storytelling, and the processes of sharing these in the space that is the theatre, that we are kind of missing right now. So what forms then can capture this, this environmental precarity? So I looked at a number of examples from 21st century theatre in Britain, which is kind of my area of research in the book. And what I noticed was a really rapid increase in particularly text-based work since the 2009 on climate change. And of course, this kind of echoes British theatre's commitment to logocentrism. So they really have a lot of text-based work. And this justifies the huge number of plays that were being put on in very mainstream venues and more fringe venues as well. But what was interesting was that this type of work was often very didactic and fact-based. So you might have scientists on stage kind of communicating information that you could also find somewhere else, or dramatized a bit. But such examples of plays that are more didactic in nature do not represent the totality and the range of theatre and performance work in the UK that is committed to climate change and the environment. In their special issue on performance and environmentalism in the Research in Drama Education, editors Deirdre Hedden and Sally Mackey warned that the work of art must leave the space for the spectator, without instructing or forcefully raising the consciousness or awareness of its audience. As key features of our time, they argue, precarity and uncertainty demand imaginative, what if, and fluid responses. And this imaginative approach can be seen in a range of text-based and not text-based examples, which focus on the materiality of things, which I'm going to come back to in a minute. So the first example I chose, just to briefly mention, kind of echoes what Eveline was saying earlier about kind of these dystopian kind of films and imagining the end of the world. Actually, contemporary theatre has a lot of dystopian plays, and there's kind of this surge of that aesthetic. And of course, one of the key features is this double bind, sort of the impasse that you can't really escape. The failure to provide resolution and transcendence. So this is a play, X, by Alistair McDowell, that completely removed humans from their planet and presented a group of scientists and astronauts who were stuck on planet Pluto, not even on planet Pluto, on a scientific base near Pluto, due to a failure of all communication systems. And the play is situated at some point in the future where the most part of the Earth is depleted. Countries have disappeared, people live in bomb shelters, nature exists only in the form of memorabilia and fractured memories and impressions of nature captured in photographs. So there are some bird whistles that sort of remind the humans of how birds sound. So that's one kind of example that I find interesting, that it doesn't necessarily shout climate change, but it kind of does for me. The other one is an installation, site responsive work that is still happening, actually. It started in 2003 and it's still presented around the world. The company Stans Caff from Birmingham. And they've created this, this piece based on a very simple premise. They try to humanize statistics, to represent the world statistics through using the device of a grain of rice. So a grain of rice represents one human being, and then they create, based on statistics they collect, they create these piles of rice that represent people around the world. And the dramaturgy of the piles of rice every time changes because statistics change. But the dramaturgy in the space draws significant comparisons between the local and the global. So, for example, in 2012, they did a show at Stratford-upon-Avon, and they wanted to draw a comparison between the refugees that fled Syria with the population of Birmingham, which was a comparable kind of statistic. And you know, the size of the piles in the space was really kind of made a difference, this materiality of the rice. And it's quite interesting how this piece scales down spectacle to echo kind of Nixon's call for slow violence, not call for slow violence, but kind of thinking about slow violence. Another example here comes from a collaboration between Fevered Sleep Theatre Company and the National Theatre Wales. And this is called The Weather Factory, which was performed in 2010. And again, they really focused on the impact of weather on, you know, how humans are affected by the weather, particularly in the UK. We will talk about the weather. So it's kind of bringing people together, but also it has a physical impact on the body. So they try to recreate the weather in different rooms in a house in Pennygroves, Wales. So you can see here, obviously, somewhat maybe artificially, but then, you know, the effect of kind of different weather conditions, whether it's really hot or really humid, were part of the same kind of environment, which was that house. So the audience member was allowed to be affected by that. So these examples are very few of the plenty of examples that exist. And actually, these artists might not specialize in creating environmental work necessarily. Maybe they won't identify with that. But there are many others, of course, who are really, their works around is very much revolving around interaction with landscape. Their processes are very much based on that. Movement artists, choreographers who work through these processes, performers, educators who work outside and do site-specific work. There's a trend of walking as performative practice as well. And I think what mobilizes all these different examples and practices is what Jane Bennett calls the vital materiality of things, which is inherent in non-human entities. And this was, again, an important kind of reference for me, because Bennett places emphasis on this curious ability of inanimate things, which are organic and inorganic, to animate, to act, to produce effects, dramatic and subtle, which emit think power. So the rice, for example, which is inanimate, emits this think power through its dramaturgy. So it's really about, you know, how objects make an impression upon us, as Ahmed would say, and this sort of how we are affected by them. And of course, in Greece, turning into a Greek context, when looking at Greek theatre, Greek performance, an eco-sensitive approach seems to be more sporadic and difficult to define, but this doesn't mean that it's absent. And on one hand, we see a handful of examples from theatre for young audiences, children's theatre, that seek to foster awareness about the value of, you know, caring for the environment, to work that takes place outside of theatre buildings, which is, again, site-specific, site-responsive work, and can be responding to urban or archaeological places very often. And makers are also concerned with the rural. So here I mention a really brilliant theatre maker, Anna Zaku, with her work Geopoetics, which is a practice focusing on an embodied experience of place and the interdependency of the human and its environment. There's another example that I came across recently, Apostolia Papadamaki's choreography, an underwater theatre performance, Drops of Breath, that was an international commission, and which involved able-bodied and disabled performers. And actually, apparently, there were audience members who could actually watch from, well, we can see them here, actually watch underwater, but also from outside. So I think there's a lot to look at in terms of practice, but it's, I think there are some questions we need to kind of think about and ask when we talk about the Greek context, the Greek example in relation to ecocriticism. So these are some questions I was thinking about in relation to my own kind of thinking. So how can a more conscious and sustained ecodramaturgy develop in Greek theatre and performance? How can this practice connect to wider questions around precarity and practices of othering? So think about the interdependency of the human and the non-human, and vulnerability as politics on a global scale. How can we develop a more dedicated ecocritical approach which will complement and extend the dialogue between theory and theatre practice in Greece? What can we learn from other initiatives and ecological processes of making work? For example, ecoscenography, which I know that has started to exist in Greece as well. How can slow violence be captured in contemporary theatre practice in relation to the Greek geographical landscape or context? So I think I will leave my presentation there, and yeah, thank you. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Marissia, for this very stimulating talk. It was really exciting to see what sort of responses these questions have initiated in the world of drama, both in the UK and in Greece. And I hope we will be able to discuss this in connection to the other talks as well. I think these three talks had a lot in common, but also showed us very different strands, very different questions, very different aspects of the problem. Daniel's talk started with showing us how green energy was presented as a solution to the chronic crisis initially, but then started sort of posing problems in itself. Eveline's talk discussed a particular cultural product and read it from an ecocritical point of view, also discussing it as a kind of eschatological, let's say, sample of literature where the ecology sort of and the end of the world blend in together. Whereas Marissia's talk discussed how theatre sort of responds to these questions, and I was particularly drawn to her concepts of ethics of care, but also this performance addiction, which is very important as a concept, and I think we can discuss this further on. We will have questions to each of our three speakers. So other questions addressed to Daniel in particular, sort of any pressing questions that are directly addressed to him?
I don't know if, hi, can I?
Of course, yes.
At the same time, I don't know if anyone else has questions. Please raise them in the chat or raise a hand, and you will pose them yourselves. But Daniel, as someone who somehow pioneered this approach in modern Greek studies, you came early and took from the big discussion the ecoturn and put it together with the crisis. And I'm so happy we put these three talks together, because as you could see, both Marissia and Eveline also talk very much directly to this type of work from their own disciplinary perspectives. What I would like you to perhaps elaborate on more. Of course, I know your work, so I'm asking from that perspective, but it might be good, especially as we have heard the others, to address that, is the issue of temporality. What you told us very early on is that during the crisis in Greece, there was a big question about futurity, the future. Suddenly, everybody was saying, you know, buy green energy, establish, turn your fields into Greek energy plots, and then there will be a future. And then somehow, if I understand you well, you did tell us that this is so much more complicated. And suddenly, instead of future, at least where you went, it brought so much the past. Yeah. Could you a little bit elaborate on that? Because I found it interesting also in relation to what we had afterwards.
Sure.
How the future of green energy be able to bring the past in the process?
Thank you, Dimitriou. As you know, I don't know, I suppose many people won't be familiar with that, but I do work on time and temporality. It's kind of my thing. So the first work coming out of doctoral studies was really how the economic crisis, when I was there doing my PhD research, so I just returned actually when the crisis struck, and I went back into the field, triggered this form of temporality where people were almost embodying, inhabiting, reliving moments of the past, but they were doing it in a topological manner, in a very scattered, almost sort of non-illogical patterns, where you think about linear progression and the linear temporal progression going in one direction, this sort of times arrow. The first narratives that I was getting from the people that I was working with when the economic crisis struck was about returning to the times of the Great Famine, the 1941 Pina. They were then talking about the economic crisis and going back to the Pina, and then tying in narratives of Ottoman landlords, the Tiflikades in Thessaly and the Tiflikia, the power relations of that, and then dancing down the road in the same narrative to dictatorships, 1967, 74, stock market crashes in the 1990s, and all these sort of moments of the past, these events. And somebody was talking there about this slow violence idea, and part of the slow violence idea is that you sort of, in slow violence, it becomes an axiom of violence because you lose the inventedness of it. You lose the actual event itself, which has to be there to make it worthy of being a crisis or of a movement. But anyway, in this first reading of temporality in the Greek crisis, the people I was working with were going back through these very disparate moments of the past, tying them all together to make a narrative of social change or of crisis that made their situation today in the contemporary time understandable, comprehensible, and also this idea that it can be overcome like other ones have been overcome in the past. But it was really inverting time's arrow and sort of this idea of falling through the past, what I call creating temporal vertigo, vertiginous experience. Of course, you flip that on the head and think of the past, you then think about how people orient themselves to the future. And that was my next project. So Orientations to the Future is the book on the anthropology of crisis that I wrote with Rebecca Bryant, and who works in Cyprus, of course. So it's not actually that far away in terms of ethnographic field. And that is how in an elongated period of crisis, where in a crisis, an epoch or a time of crisis, if you want to use my own sort of terminology, the present becomes elongated, inescapable. People are hyper-conscious of what they do now affects the future in ways that it didn't do before. You're sort of hyper-conscious of one's own existence in a strange, weird, uncanny time space of the social political. How do they then sort of, how do you escape that? By imagining the future or breaking this horizon of the future, very often by folding the future into the present through everyday routines like potentiality, aspirations, hopes, expectations for the future, which have become transformed because your expectations that people were being born into, this sort of expectations of birthrights in the European Union, in the West, in these modern times, have been thrown into disarray by a moment of crisis. So then futures are also thrown into a great relief and reassessed. Now the energy comes in on this, sorry, that was a bit of a long way of saying it, but the energy comes into this from following my own research participants who I was working with agriculturalists on the plains of Thessaly, and almost overnight, within the space of 6 months, the European Union had come in with the Greek government and said, okay, you can't sell your crops at markets, wholesalers have gone bust, consumption is down, beyond subsistence agriculture, there's nothing else that you can really do as a livelihood here. We've brought renewable energy. Why not put solar panels on your land, and we'll pay you for 25-year contracts, almost like a rentier agreement, to produce energy, and that energy is planned to be exported to Northern Europe. Now, people that I talked to bought into that knowing that it was a short-term sort of neoliberal plan. They didn't ever believe that there would be subsidies for 25 years. They knew that it was probably going to crash on its face. But the priorities at the time was sort of putting food on the table, paying the rent, paying for, you know, the everyday necessities of life in the real dark times of the economic crisis in the early 2010s. But yeah, for me, the striking thing about that in terms of temporality was the future that they were promised there was based on this idea of holier than thou, I'd say, green technology. This, you know, green, how can something green, clean, sustainable, supported by all these political institutions actually be extractive? You know, we're not talking about oil, we're not talking about mineral mining, we're talking about sun and wind, inexhaustible energies, resources. And the trigger effect of that, when it didn't actually serve the local communities, was again to invert time's arrow. The material objects, the interaction with material objects of futurity, were triggering almost this sense again of spiraling down through the past, as people would, what they'd say, resort to archaic or peasant or village pre-modern ways of heating their homes on the plains. And I just think it's a real ironic picture, a paradoxical picture of having these photovoltaic panels and not being able to see them from the house that I stay in because of the toxic smog descending over the plains, when people are lighting their alternative ways of heating the homes, their alternative energy sources, if you like. And that's where the question comes in. Can, on the ground, on the grassroots level, can the green economy ever provide truly sustainable futures for local communities whilst operating within the apparatus of neoliberal capitalist market economies? And I mean, that's the question which I sort of leave open.
Thank you. We have a question in the Q&A. The question comes from Elvira Webfer, if I pronounce it correctly, and I'm going to read it out. Hi, my question is for Daniel. The radical ecology of Syriza was not realized. Are you aware of any grassroots solutions that have picked them up and developed them further? What are their scopes?
Thank you. Hi, Elvira. It's nice to see you as such. Yeah, it's a good question. Now, I sort of put the radical ecology of Syriza there, almost tongue in cheek. I mean, I have no, and I stress this, you know, I have no political orientations or allegiances. And I know that sometimes my scholarship is seen as sort of supporting a Northern European, perhaps neoliberal stance towards the Greek crisis, completely unintentionally, I must say. So this wasn't a dig at Syriza, it wasn't a dig at any sort of political party, but having seen the constitutions and a lot of the papers around the pre-election of Syriza in 2014-15, when they eventually came to power in 2015, working with a think tank in Cornell, actually, radical ecology was one of their solutions to repay debt and decrease deficit when coming to power. Was it ever realized? No, I don't think it was, but I think that this was the one time that policies towards the economy had sort of been passed down, the baton down. It started in the pre-crisis New Democracy days. It was taken up by PASOK and then Syriza, and it never really went away because it was being very much promoted by European Union throughout all of these years, and just repackaged and repackaged and repackaged. Has there been any grassroots solutions picked up? Well, I went to a conference in 2012, a photovoltaic exhibition at the out near the airport in Athens, at the exhibition center. And there I was shown these three models. So you had macro scale solar generation, photovoltaic generation. And the idea here was that they would build the biggest solar parks in the world. And they started with the project Ilios around Kozani. And this was for international export. And Greece would become the supplier of solar energy to Europe and a lot of the sort of Northern Hemisphere. Then you had the mesoscale, which was the agricultural land, and that was for local communities supposedly and for urban centres in Greece. And then you had the micro level sustainability, household self-sufficiency, photovoltaic panels for individual homes. And I sort of asked that question, what do you think is the most sustainable here? And certainly the home installations for the individual houses were really, you know, if that had been promoted over everything else, I think that that was a way for this self-sufficiency for the homes. And there was quite a lot of investment interest in both small-scale wind and small-scale solar, but it wasn't selling as a big political rhetoric. The big political rhetoric was, let's pay off debt, let's decrease the deficit, international export, you know, alternative livelihood for farmers and all of that. And the small-scale ones, which was really quite effective on the ground at giving people lower energy bills, helping them produce their own electricity, those were not supported on the level of politics because they just weren't hard-hitting enough. They wouldn't get you sort of re-elected. So yeah, there are community projects. I won't go on too much, but there are community projects as well, particularly on small-scale wind that I've come across in Thessaly and in Greek Macedonia. Investment by people who have their own lands to put this on. Those are serving very much, like I say, the small scale, which I think would interest Elvira, the small scale communal levels, rather than being these massive political programs.
Thank you. If I'm allowed a brief question myself, Dimitriou talked about futuricity as regards time. I'm going to ask you about historization. Sort of, you described an initial period of optimism as regards green energy, yeah. And then you went on to describe a later stage of letdown or defeat or the disillusionment. And I was wondering where you could pinpoint the borderline. I mean, if you could sort of say when this period of defeat, of problematizing the idea of green energy in Greece started.
Yeah. I mean, I've always been told that I'm a pessimist with these things. When we were writing that book, The Anthropology of the Future, we focused on 6 orientations to the future. And my co-author, Rebecca Bryant, would always come up with the most optimistic, you know, hope and speculation. And I'd be saying, well, what about apathy and resignation and exhaustion with the future? And there was a sort of feeling of a flip side like that, to do these sort of everyday orientations to the future through the lens of energy. And like I say, it was a package which was launched in about 2008. So that was pre-crisis, 2007, 2008. And it was then brought as this big rhetoric of a savior program in 2011 in its first incarnation. So there was a lot of positivity around it when the feed-in tariffs were very high. Every 6 months, the feed-in tariffs would drop. So in the UK, for home installations, the feed-in tariffs at the time were about 9 pence per kilowatt hour. In Greece, they were 55 cents to begin with. So you can see that there's a big economic incentive. For every kilowatt hour the solar panel was producing, the feed-in tariff was 55 cents compared to 9 pence in the UK. And then that was like the introductory price on the Greek markets. People were quite taken by this. There was a lot of contracts given out on it. And then every 6 months, this feed-in tariff would drop. And it became very clear, it was quite clear quite early on amongst the directors of the that I talked to in Thessaly, that this was unsustainable. The feed-in tariffs were far too high, the uptake was far bigger. The engineering tasks of connecting this to an ailing grid, and Jane Bennett talks about infrastructures, including energy grids, as having their own lives, and sort of this interaction between the social and the technical, which interests me, the social-technical landscape, wasn't fit for all this massive uptake of solar on such a grand scale. And I reckon within about 5 years, and it was the same time as we had all the sort of issues with smog in Greece, so around about 2014, 15, maybe 2015, the program, the renewable energy program, was actually frozen, using the term frozen. And that's when it was sort of halted, no more were put onto the grid. And people started understanding the fact that this wasn't a long-term sustainable option for the future. By that time, we'd already had, of course, a lot of the feelings on the ethnographic level, on the level of narrative, about this is a new program of colonialism. We've got German technology, Israeli inductors, Chinese products flooding the market, and taking these resources without any input into the local community. So the extractive economy, the historic narratives of occupation that I mentioned, to do with the Ottoman landlords, the Axis occupation, German occupation, this is a new form of German technology on our lands. All of those narratives, meta-narratives of crisis, were there from about 2014-15, when the realization was that it wouldn't be a sustainable, at least at the grassroots level, wouldn't be a sustainable option for more than 5 or 6 years.
Thank you very much. Do we have any other questions for Daniel? If not, then we can move on to our next speaker, Eveline. If there are not any pressing questions from the audience, then I can ask mine. Or I thought that this, I mean, there might be a trend in contemporary Greek literature as regards the ecology and ecosystems and this sort of thinking about the future. And perhaps you could think about the Chernobyl disaster, which was the theme of a recent book, a recent novel by Akis Papandonis, Erichon Eros Kies, Shallow Waters, Shadows, and also a novella by Michalis Makropoulos entitled Mavro Nero, Black Water. So I think that, you know, you could combine your very succinct observations on Dimitriou with other contemporary samples and develop this into a very exciting project.
Could I jump in and add to that question? Sorry. And well, tell us a little bit about the larger context. And do these works tend to be more allegorical, or at least read allegorically? Everyone who talks about ecological disaster in Greece today, are they being taken allegorical? Do they write allegorically like Dimitriou, or are there other trends as well?
Okay, thank you both. Thank you, Eleni, for the suggestions. I will definitely have a look at that. I'm always very grateful for this type of suggestions, because as a Dutch person, I'm not in the loop, the immediate loop of new literary trends. So that's great. Thank you. And Dimitris, thank you for your question as well. Maybe I'll just briefly, if that's possible still, yeah, share my screen again, just to go to the two other objects, so I can give a good answer to your question. All right, so one moment. Yes, okay, so what as I mentioned, I was very interested in, okay, what type of futures are being imagined, and then specifically the type of futures that were produced in this period of 2008 to 2018-19, in which, of course, Greece was an entanglement of all these different crises at the same time, right? So we have Europe's migrant reception crisis, we have the financial, the Greek national deficit crisis, and then there's climate change as a looming bigger crisis, and then now, of course, COVID-19 happened as well. I'm sorry. So I was really curious. Okay, when the imagining the future is made difficult. Think, for instance, also personally, when you are in depth, you are not in control of your own future. You don't have the ability, the financial luxury to plan and establish your own future. The debtor has this luxury for you. So it was a bit based on this idea of Maurizio and Lazzarato, I think, yeah. And what I noticed in these different cultural objects, so I really wanted to pick different forms as well, formats. So there's the literary example, which we discussed today. Then there's a more intellectual journalist piece, which is the Life on the Green Islands of Southern Europe in 2049 of Tsangari. And then there is the Aegean Data Haven, a cooperative platform in the Archipelago of Kyriaki Goni, the multimedia artist. Now, coming to this idea of allegory, which of course fits very well the story of Dimitriou, in the Aegean data haven, I would say it's actually it's a visual representation of also a future autonomous island collaboration, also focusing actually on green energy extraction. So that's where that topic links very well with Daniel's work. And here there's very much to like sketches and technological imaginations of the future, which would benefit the local population actually. So actually it's quite of I don't know how you would call it, a new realist or a techno-realist type of imagination. So it is, of course, there are parts which are also allegorical, because, for instance, the idea of myth is being suggested as a useful idea in this context. So the myth of water and the islands rising from the water, and this type of you could call this the allegorical aspect of this artwork, but it's also very in a way it's sort of technology heavy, so there it has a very different approach. And then the other object, so the article Tsangari, was really a comparison between Tilos, the Greek island, and the Green Energy Initiative, which are currently happening there, and a Spanish island, part of the Canary Islands. And there it was a vision, a future vision of how these now currently hopeful and good-looking green energy initiatives, how they could possibly develop in the future, so in 2049. And what Tsangari did was really contrast Tilos and the Spanish island, because she let Tilos completely fail and the Spanish island succeed. And then she gave some reasons why this was the case. So that, I would say, is not an allegorical way at all. It's a type of, yes, the concepts that I used here, of course, were utopian, dystopian imaginations of different developments of the future, how these imaginations would take shape in the future. So I think, even though I don't think I use the word allegory at all in my thesis, it's definitely it's most suited to this work of Dimitriou, and I'm very curious to see, how this topic would engage with the other novels, the books that Eleni brought forward just now. So thank you. I will stop sharing. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Just to follow on that, I was wondering to what extent you think that Dimitriou's work, this particular novella, discusses a local case as opposed to a global case. I mean, if it's a wider example that can be read from a global perspective.
I think that actually this idea of allegorism is what makes it so suitable actually for a global debate, because the island, of course, it's an imagined island. It's not mentioned which Greek island. That doesn't really matter. Of course, there are some mentioning of the history or political situation of the family democracy, which is you can read it as interpreted as the Greek nation state before this radical change, so this split of regions. So I actually read it, also with an interest in general in islands and archipelagos and collections of islands, which I think have very much in common. Ecology-wise, I think they're, of course, what we see now, they're ecologically very vulnerable structures, and economically as well. I mean, this is what we see now with the COVID crisis, that islands that are fully depending on tourism as an income they are facing and about to face very dire consequences of this one crisis. So I think there's a precarity, to use one of the concepts that was also mentioned by our other panel speaker, that it's that's central to islands, so not necessarily Greek islands at all. Yes, and also I think the island that is the protagonist society in this novella, I think it's really contrasted with its neighboring countries, its neighboring states. So also this country who are following a more of a, still this progress-oriented, like economic progress-oriented narrative. So also this contrast, gives some ability to the novel to also be read in and outside of just the Greek context.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Maria has a question. She has brought it up in the chat.
Yeah, thanks, Eleni. Just a short question or comment, really, picking up on the notion of slow violence that Marissia brought up in her own presentation, and also the question that Marissia posed of which forms, also representational strategies, expressive modes, aesthetic forms, etc., are suitable for sort of switching the way that we understand our relation of the human to the environment, etc. And then linking this to Eveline's discussion of the end of Dimitriou's novella, where you have the end of that sort of utopian civilization that came after the end of the other civilization as we know it, let's say, and the way that this is, as you said, within like half a page, very casually narrated as almost a natural phenomenon, and certainly not an event, not a historical event. So I wanted to invite you to comment perhaps on that, on the kind of form or representational strategy that is underlying this description, and that might be a way of, or one of the possible answers to the question of the form that Marissia posed in her talk.
Yes, thank you very much, Maria. I definitely think this is one of the crucial things about my talk today, that the difference in representation of the end of the world or the end of human civilization between more popular representations and then this particular example. Of course, there are many shades and many, but I mean, what we focus on today. I think that yes, I like this idea of that you say it's not represented as an event as such. And I have to admit that that is what first struck me as weird in the novel. So I was not completely satisfied actually as a reader. I thought, I told you as well, I loved the novella, but it finished, it ended so rapidly, and he didn't spend any time, descriptive time at all to this what is supposed to be, or what we've learned to see as an event. So I think that's a very crucial moment there for sure. What I think as well, if we, I'm not that experienced in looking at things in an ecocritical way yet, but I think one of the important things here is as well in this book that there is not really a protagonist in this work. It's really about the description of the society. And even in the end, when one of the protagonists is sort of brought, one of the characters is given a name, which has not really happened, that distinguishedly before. It's really not about this person either. It's really, I think, about these different civilizations, and that he switches, that he becomes the link between the summertime civilization, as I call it, which has ended, and the border zone civilization, which we don't know what happens to it. It doesn't really matter. There are, I think, 5 pages of, in total, 83, 85 are given to this new beginning. It's also very much not represented as a civilization of hope whatsoever. It's really radically different in all these things. So the novel really doesn't answer our learned reader expectations of, okay, but the society, there was a downfall of the society. the protagonist lives on in another one, and then there's hope of this society becoming the new protagonist society. That's not at all the case, and I think that's definitely the strength of this novella from an ecocriticism perspective.
Yeah, and I think I agree, and that's also perhaps why sort of framing this particular novella through allegory might, or collapsing all these strategies of defamiliarization really into allegory might sort of draw attention away from what is happening there actually on different levels in the narrative. So yeah, just a thought.
Okay, thank you.
Are there any other questions for Eveline? If not, then we move on to Marissia.
I have a question for Marissia if there aren't others, but of course I understand that I have asked before. Shall I go ahead?
Any questions from our audience? Because I would like to encourage people to actually ask questions. You can raise your hand and you can open your microphone, but as I understood, you cannot switch on your camera.
Well, shall I ask in the meantime and then?
Yes, yes.
There is a question that somehow links that discussion we have had. It comes to my mind how much there has been a discussion about new solar and especially wind energy at the moment in the Greek islands, and that somehow leads to our discussion about the Greek island in Eveline's example. And thinking about Marissia's presentation, all the time you have been talking, Marissia, I was thinking of this experience that we all have about Greek islands. There is always in a Greek island, especially in the smaller islands, there will always be like a beach that's kind of will be sort of operating as a commune. You can find it in nudist beaches or in beaches where there is still free camping, even though, and of course this is always supported at a level through discourses that you could say are utopianist. I mean, people are there helping each other, trying to find their inner self. This has come in very handy for Greece and Greek tourism since, I don't know, for decades at least. And it's dawned on me how much of a performance this is. At some point, but also, and how much it has all this positive green kind of message. At the same time, those of us who are close to these events, we know that often there is a lot of too much performance, and at the same time there is not always good care of the environment. Even in these kind of utopian strategies. And now this was a comment, and this is now my question. Looking through your examples, I was wondering how much there's a double bind there, or like a circle that we cannot really break. I mean, we talk so much about the Anthropocene, we talk so much about all this kind of no futures in the carbon futures, and we put everything together like in a huge gallery with many attendants, where people have to go from all over the UK and pay the visit, or then we have this kind of major theater events that kind of somehow participate in a big capitalist, expansionist institutional framework often, and there is all this kind of parallel market going on in these artworks. So how much can you sort of break that circle? How much of this art, especially, and I'm asking you because maybe you have the answer through performance, but how much of this art is kind of free of the vicious circle of both overusing materials and various forms of energy, and of the capitalist market that comes with it.
Absolutely, thank you, Dimitriou. Yeah, I mean, there's this debate about how non-green theatre is because of its lack of recycling. So even, you know, scenographers or people who work in stage design, they want to use same materials and they can't store them anywhere, so they need to get rid of them, which is really, you know, unreasonable. But also a lot of theatre pieces that I didn't mention, I kind of indirectly mentioned, that have been staged at the National Theatre, and that's, you know, waste all this massive source of energy in terms of water source, in terms of electricity, and they talk about climate change. You know, critics have drawn attention to this, like, what are you doing? You know, you're not really, it's the representation itself and not the material conditions. I think, so from the examples I mentioned, Stan's Caf, for example, the rice show, has, you know, they have taken into account sustainability, and for example, the rice is washed and recycled, so they give it to animal feed after each show because they have to travel, of course. So yeah, so I suppose there is a, you know, in terms of the material conditions, there is a an ecological kind of approach to this. I think with the site's responsive work is more interesting. So the work of Anna Zaku, for example, the work that other people are doing in the actual environment that emphasizes this small, you know, scaling down and emphasize slowness. So I think, you know, the slow violence kind of is there again, how we can include slowness or kind of address slowness in terms of becoming aware, because I think that's one of the issues, that we can't really perceive what's happening is because we're you know, moving around so fast. We always consume, perform, you know, all that performance addiction. So I think there is a shift, a perception shift as well that needs to happen, and it's happening through engaging with such work, particularly if you're participating rather than consuming, like from a distance, in a sense. So I think these works are really responsive to these questions, kind of ethically. I want to respond to the other comment you made in the beginning about the Greek islands and the beaches. It kind of, I had this image in my mind. I watched this film Santan a few years back when it was released, and that was such an interesting. I mean, I also spent my summer in Antiparos, you know, and all that camping, and that nostalgia for this sort of utopian past, everything is carefree, and suddenly, you know, how everything gets really dark. I also read it as an allegory for, you know, the contemporary Greek context, but yeah, it's interesting how the utopian kind of connects to this nostalgia for the past, and the present is like this stretched out present that's, as we said, you know, it's like you're stuck and you can't really move on. So I think there is something interesting there in a lot of theatre work as well, this feeling of being stuck more than nostalgia, maybe. I think nostalgia is a very Greek trope as well, I think. You can see it in a lot of cultural artifacts. But yeah, so yeah, so I just want to raise that in terms of temporality kind of question we raised before, that there is a lot of that, particularly regarding children as well, and this arrested development. So how particularly male children, how they can't grow up and become, you know, male, kind of masculine adults, etc. So there's something interesting that connects the environment and questions around the environment for me with questions of gender, questions of race as well. But yeah, that's for another talk, I suppose.
And And I wanted to just add that I was thinking about Dimitri's question and your response. I mean, how ecological these pieces about ecology are, in the sense that they produce massive amounts of waste, as you described, but also the ways that they participate in a mode of production that is very much, I mean, it depends on travel, it depends on capital. I mean, the modes of economy that produce this type of works, you know, are not very ecological at all, and perhaps they cannot escape from this model. I suppose.
It is a double bind, absolutely. I mean, I know that particularly under COVID, a lot of theatre practitioners are exploring the, you know, possibilities of being carbon-free using online resources. Well, it's not exactly carbon-free, but at least you don't have to travel and don't have to transport people to rehearse, or you can work internationally without having to do that. And I know one of a very famous British director who works a lot in Europe, Katie Mitchell, who has kind of an ecological strand to her work, is actually exploring this possibility now and doing more kind of online rehearsals in advance of her piece, so to avoid kind of having that travel included. So yeah, I think these are questions that become quite apparent now. I don't know, again, to what extent in the Greek context, these are questions that are really important at the moment, in terms of particularly international work maybe, but it's definitely something that a lot of institutions are thinking about in the UK, theatre institutions and theatre companies, practitioners, which is a positive move.
Are there any questions that combine sort of all, you know, that span over the three presentations that can be sort of addressed to all three speakers, or, you know, overarch all three topics?
Well, I have a brief comment question, but I would like the audience also to ask. Of course, we only have 5 minutes before this expires. But one of our aims when we were setting this up, not only this conversation today, but the whole network, is to also keep raising questions, topics, methodologies, issues that in modern Greece, but also in modern Greek studies, we think are not necessarily concerning us. So Marissia mentioned the issue of race just now, and you would hear often in Greece that race is not something really that pertains to the issues facing in Greece. Gender, we have heard so much about this before, you know, somehow Greece is impervious to that whole gender imbalance and sexuality questions, and somehow, or it is not ready. And to an extent, even though not at the same level, the whole eco term has often been downplayed and disavowed. I still remember, you know, often in election period where people said, you know, we're too poor to think about that. You know, the economy is not ready for all those kind of bohem ideas, etc. And I wanted to play this out and ask you all, and I know Daniel, how do you think creating this new input, how difficult is it in a modern Greek studies environment that hasn't yet started this conversation?
Would any of the panelists like to answer? Daniel, did you raise your hand? Yes.
I think that's a very good point, Dimitriou. It's an eco term. That's precisely why I sort of termed it a time of sustainability. It was something which, and I was asked there about sort of when would you pinpoint the futural hope turning to futural disillusion. But it was an it is an eco-turn in Greece that I sort of got as an anthropologist from the grassroots first. It was before any sort of big political rhetorics going on. And that's why it was things ranging from the lady who I've lived with and known for 20 years suddenly started recycling. I mean, she's now got her colored bins, and the village has the colored bins, and they recycle. The 15 years out of those 20 that I've known her, there's no way that she would have been in that. And she's absolutely obsessed about it. You have cycling clubs pass by and you sort of think, well, that's just new visually. That's a visual landscape has changed. The infrastructure of the towns of places like Precarity and their provision for cycle lanes and all these types of issues that I mentioned as part of a time of sustainability was an eco-turn. Now, I've been writing about this since 2011-12. In 2014, Alexis Tsipras visited the London School of Economics, 13-14, and I was there as a fellow at the Hellenic Observatory. And he gave his sort of manifesto. It was before he came to power, and he gave his manifesto of how he sort of get the Greek economy back on track. And the first question from the crowd, and this is all on, you can find it on YouTube, and you can find it on the LSE's feed, and I've also written about it in Anthropology Today, a short article on the green economy. And the first thing that he was asked was, so we see these pictures of smog coming down over the town. We can see people having breathing difficulties with their asthma. You can see that there's no energy. It's a massive, massive drain on people's finance. You know, all the taxes are on your electricity bill. People can't pay these. What is your policy for energy going forward? And I mean, again, I say that I have no political allegiances at all, but he kind of just smirked. That's not the problem. The economy is the problem. And you're thinking, well, how can you not understand that energy and economy go together in these things? And it's one of the same thing. The next question from the floor, to pick up on your next point, was, so women have been disadvantaged by the economic crisis. You know, how does gender, what sort of policies have you got by gender? And it was, gender's not a problem in Greece. The economy is the problem. And again, that sort of misunderstanding that these domains are not in any way interlinked. And there's such a massive focus from scholars, particularly in sort of my side of the social sciences and anthropology and such, like on the economy, the economy, the economy. Often the sort of the grassroots interests in ecology, environments, in the past, like you quite rightly say, it's been gender, now it's race as well, are overlooked because on the level of the political scientists that I was working with at the LSE and the political economists, you know, it was not on the agenda. It was not on their agenda, and it wasn't part of the economic recovery, economy in front of everything, or indeed politics in front of everything.
Perhaps that's a good question to put to all the panelists, but perhaps Eveline, would you like to respond to that as well? And then Marissia? To what extent do you think that Greece, what you were seeing of Greece is mature to address this type of topics?
I think that, of course, there are always different levels. And what I notice at the moment, and I'm happy to see that living in Greece with my experience from living in the Netherlands, is that there is a growing awareness of global heating, of climate change, and of things that we could implement in our daily lives to help a bit. So being critical consumers, yeah, I'll just we'll keep it very quick. Now the question is indeed on the political level, is this happening? And in the academic circles, like where we are as well, articles, is this happening? And I find it very difficult. I cannot claim I have this oversight, but at least in this type of daily life, I notice a difference at the moment. Yes. Maybe Marissia would like to answer briefly.
Yeah, very quickly. I think I'm more of a pessimist, maybe because I haven't visited Greece for over a year. So I feel we've lost a lot of time. And we're really behind. I think we need to really act really rapidly, because it's great that people start realizing that they need to recycle, but that's like scratching the surface. And it's really, I mean, we should really move on and address all these other issues that we, Dimitriou also mentioned, how gender and race and all these kind of histories are important to connect to climate change. So I think, yeah, I wish we could speed up for slowing down in a sense, you know, if that makes sense.
Well, thank you all. I think I've been notified that we should round this up very soon. Thank you so very much to all three of you for these very exciting and very stimulating talks. And I would like to yield the floor to Maria and Dimitris, perhaps to round up this conversation and discuss the future roundtable discussions with us.
Yeah, thank you, Eleni, so much and to all the panelists for those really fascinating talks and the discussion that followed. And I think some of the issues that were mentioned just at the end of the discussion, the intersection of environmental issues with race, with gender, and of course we should add social class there, because to go back to Daniel's talk, I think not everybody needed to burn their furniture to keep warm, of course, during the crisis, right? So this is definitely also class-related issue and problematics. Many of those will actually come up in the next roundtables that we are planning. And maybe, Dimitriou, you want to, in any case, race, this is one of the topics that we want to address in one of our next roundtables. But I'll give the floor to Dimitriou, and big thanks to everybody for participating and for the discussion.
Well, thanks to all. A big thanks to Torch, the Oxford Research Centre for the Humanities, and to Amber Khalidi, who has been helping us with everything from technical to putting together our blog. I invite you all to visit our blog, and those of you who will see this at a later time, please go back to the blog. We will invite speakers today to participate and perhaps contribute a short blog entry after the experience of this conversation. This is about opening conversations and doing it from modern Greek studies, but with also a local and a global perspective. So please write to us with any feedback. Now, I wanted to also say that it is part of our mission, and you can read more about that on the blogs, to put together different disciplines, different disciplinary perspectives, and to show how important that is. We saw that today very well, I think, how anthropology, literary criticism, and also literary close reading come together with this marvelous approach to theater studies, new trends that moved so beautifully from the local to the global. And thank you all for coming in. I don't know if we are receiving thanks from the audience. It is always such a difficult thing to get the audience to ask questions. And for this reason, I do apologize for having to jump in sometimes and for asking so many. Join us again in November for a panel on Golden Dawn. And we call it Golden Dawn, the end of the story, ? And in December for a panel on islands and camps from Leros to Lesbos, as well as in the new year with many other